The chief executives of the world's biggest drug companies have signed a joint pledge promising to uphold the integrity of the scientific process while developing coronavirus vaccines. The pledge says they will only submit for approval or emergency use authorization after demonstrating safety and efficacy through a phase 3 clinical study. The statement goes on to say, "We believe this pledge will help ensure public confidence in the rigorous scientific and regulatory process by which COVID-19 vaccines are evaluated." And among the signatories are AstraZeneca and Pfizer, who both have candidate vaccines in those phase 3 trials. Well, given the huge human cost of the pandemic, of course, the race to find a vaccine is paramount everywhere, and there are signs that governments may be willing to cut corners or fast-track the process, depending on your point of view. Russia has already licensed its vaccine. It's called Sputnik 5, before test results were even published. They have now released the results of the trial, but experts say it wasn't large or rigorous enough to meet international standards. It's not just Russia where this is an issue. In the US, the presidential election in November is creating a huge incentive for President Trump to get a vaccine out before then, and he's not been shy about speaking about that.
It's going to be done in a very short period of time. Could even have it during the month of October. The vaccine will be very safe and very effective, and it'll be delivered very soon. You could have a very big surprise coming up.
While the regulator too is keen to speed things up. The head of the US Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, says he would be willing to bypass the normal approval process for licensing a vaccine. Stephen Hahn told the Financial Times the legal, medical and scientific standard is that the benefit outweighs the risk in a public health emergency. Well, Thomas Kuhne is Director General of the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers, which represents the companies who signed the pledge. And he's with us live here on Outside Source. Thank you very much indeed for your time. I just wonder why you felt it necessary to put out this pledge.
I think it's really important to reassure the public, but also send a message to regulator. We all desperately want a vaccine against the coronavirus. We want a vaccine, however, which is safe, effective, and of high quality. And we can't afford to cut corners. And that's why the message from the vaccine manufacturer CEOs, but also the message from all our member companies was important.
Is Russia cutting corners?
When you look at the speed with which that vaccine was licensed, I am concerned that some corners were cut, because when you talk about and look at the pledge which was issued today, everybody agrees that you need phase 3 clinical trials, which means it can't be done with just testing a vaccine for safety efficacy on 50 or so volunteers. We are talking here about clinical trials involving tens of thousands of people. For example, the Pfizer-BioNTech trial, which is far advanced, there one does talk about 30,000 volunteers, of which part of them get the vaccine, part of them get the placebo. And you will need to look whether people do still get infected, whether they do get COVID-19. And then you need to check whether those who get it got the placebo, whether the vaccine works or not. All these things do need time. We are talking about fast development, but you really need to move as fast as possible, but at the same time, as slow as needed.
But Mr. Kuhne, if I could just come in here, though, you mentioned that everyone agrees you need stage 3 clinical trials, but the FDA in the US has suggested that perhaps that isn't necessary. So you're out of sync with the Americans.
Not quite when you look at the manufacturers, and they are the ones submitting the dossier for approval. All of them in their pledge today committed to large clinical trials. Well, when you look at
okay, so you're right, the manufacturers are saying that, but just so I'm really clear, these huge pharmaceutical manufacturers are essentially saying the primary authority on this matter in the US is wrong.
Not quite, because when you look at the guidance from the FDA, and that hasn't changed, everybody expects large clinical trials. What's also important is that the companies commit to publishing the results of the clinical trials, whether they are good or bad. They are committed to full transparency. And just last week, we had a big global media briefing with some of the CEOs who signed the trial, and they said they also are in favor of an independent external expert advisory committee helping the FDA to reach the right conclusion. Therefore, the message is clear. There is a temptation for politicians to push a vaccine approval faster than might be good for the testing of the quality and safety.
Well, in which case,
but the manufacturers are clear they don't want that to happen.
In which case, can you be clear with me here? We heard Donald Trump yesterday saying he thinks a vaccine could be possible by October. That would have raised the expectations of not just Americans, but people all around the world. Is he wrong to suggest that's possible?
I think it's challenging. We can expect some results of these large clinical trials maybe by the end of October, but then you still need to look at the data. You still need to validate the data. I think it's fairly unlikely that we will have a vaccine approved or in particular distributed at large scale before the end of this year. We may be surprised, but clearly the manufacturers do not want speed above quality.
And finally, can I ask you about whether you're certain a vaccine is possible? Because a vaccine of this nature has never been created before. Are we now at the stage in research where we can say this will happen, it's just a question of when?
I'm personally optimistic. Having discussed this with many of the scientists involved, I believe we will get the vaccine. It is a question about when. It's also a question, will the vaccine have the same effect on all sorts of population, the young as well as the elderly, because the early trials have basically been done on younger populations, and we don't know yet how long the immunity will last. But I'm optimistic we'll see a vaccine.